In the gleaming marble corridors of Ravencrest Palace, where tradition weighs heavier than the golden crown jewels themselves, a single tear can shatter centuries of royal protocol. When King Edmund VII made the decision that would forever alter the fabric of his marriage, he never imagined the consequences would echo through the palace walls like thunder in a storm. Queen Isabella, once the commoner who captured a prince's heart against all odds, now finds herself standing at the center of a royal crisis that threatens to tear apart not just her family, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Behind the ornate doors and beneath the watchful eyes of crimson-clad guards, a battle is brewing, one where love, duty, and blood ties collide in ways that will leave no one unchanged. This is the story of how a queen's tears became a kingdom's turning point, and how sometimes the most powerful person in the realm can also be the most powerless when faced with the choice between crown and heart. In a world where every gesture is scrutinized and every emotion must be measured, what happens when the mask finally slips? The guards have seen many things in their years of service, but nothing could have prepared them for the day their queen would break down before their very eyes, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Isabella made her way through the eastern wing, her silk slippers whispering against the ancient stone. The palace had been her home for nearly 15 years now, yet today it felt more like a gilded prison than the sanctuary it once was. Every portrait of long-dead monarchs seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes, and every servant's bow felt like a reminder of the invisible chains that bound her to this life of ceremony and obligation. Isabella paused before the towering windows that overlooked the royal gardens, where her husband King Edmund was already engaged in his morning conference with the Lord Chamberlain and various ministers. Even from this distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands moved with calculated precision as he gestured during conversation. These were the same hands that had once trembled when he first asked for her hand in marriage, the same voice that had whispered promises of a different kind of life together. But that was before the crown became more than just a symbol. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Isabella turned to see her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, hurrying toward her with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. Margaret had been with the royal household for over 20 years, serving first Edmund's mother and now Isabella. She was a woman of few words, but deep loyalty, which made the worry lines creasing her weathered face all the more significant. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, offering a curtsy that seemed more hurried than usual. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room." He said it was a matter of utmost importance. Isabella felt her stomach tighten. Edmund rarely summoned her to the throne room unless it involved official royal business, and official royal business had become increasingly strained territory between them in recent months. "Did he mention the nature of this matter?" "No, Your Majesty, but—" Margaret hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were alone. The ministers who left his study earlier appeared quite agitated. Lord Blackwood was muttering something about maintaining the integrity of the crown as he passed. Lord Blackwood. Isabella's jaw clenched at the mention of the man who had become her husband's closest advisor and, increasingly, the voice of traditional royal protocol in Edmund's ear. Where once Edmund had valued progressive thinking and modernizing the monarchy, Blackwood had slowly poisoned those ideals with talk of ancient customs and the proper way of things. Isabella straightened her shoulders and smoothed the fabric of her emerald morning dress. "Very well. Please inform His Majesty that I will attend him shortly." As Margaret curtsied and departed, Isabella remained by the window for a moment longer, watching her husband's animated discussion in the garden below. Something in his posture told her that whatever awaited her in the throne room would change everything between them, and not for the better. The walk to the throne room felt longer than usual, each step echoing with an ominous finality that made Isabella's heart race despite her attempts to maintain royal composure. The ornate doors stood guard like sentinels, their carved lions and roses seeming to mock her with their frozen nobility. Two guards snapped to attention as she approached, their red uniforms pristine, and their faces carefully blank in the way that all palace staff had perfected. Inside the throne room, King Edmund stood with his back to the massive golden chair that had seated rulers of Ethermore for over 3 centuries. The room's vaulted ceiling stretched high above them, decorated with murals depicting great victories and noble deeds of past monarchs. Today, however, the grandeur felt oppressive rather than inspiring. Edmund turned as she entered, and Isabella was struck by how much older he looked than his 43 years. The stress of ruling had carved lines around his dark eyes and peppered his once rich brown hair with premature silver. Yet it was not the physical changes that concerned her most, but the distant coldness that had crept into his gaze over the past months. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used during state functions rather than the warmth she remembered from their private moments. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course." She moved closer, noting how he remained standing rather than taking his customary seat. This was meant to be a formal audience, then, not a conversation between husband and wife. Margaret mentioned this was urgent. Edmund nodded, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of his late father, who had ruled with an iron fist and little tolerance for sentiment. "I'm afraid we need to discuss some changes that must be implemented immediately. Changes that affect both the monarchy and our household." Isabella felt the first cold tendrils of dread curling around her heart. "What sort of changes?" "The Royal Council has brought several matters to my attention regarding the influence of certain family connections on the stability of our reign." Edmund's words were measured and careful, as if he had rehearsed them. "There are concerns about maintaining proper royal protocols and ensuring that the crown's authority remains unquestionable." "You're speaking in riddles, Edmund. Please tell me plainly what this is about." For the first time, a flicker of the man she married showed through the royal mask. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes as he continued. "Your brother Thomas and your sister Catherine have been relieved of their positions within the royal household. Their access to the palace will be restricted to formal occasions only, and their advisory roles have been terminated." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Thomas had served as an unofficial liaison between the royal household and various charitable organizations, while Catherine had been instrumental in organizing the Queen's social calendar and managing relationships with foreign dignitaries' wives. Both positions had been created specifically to include Isabella's family in royal life, a gesture that had meant everything to her when she first became queen. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her understood all too well. "They've done nothing wrong. Their service has been exemplary." "This isn't about wrongdoing," Edmund replied, finally, meeting her gaze. "It's about perception. The council feels that having too many members of your birth family in positions of influence creates an impression of favoritism and undermines traditional royal hierarchy." "Traditional royal hierarchy." Isabella repeated the words as if they tasted bitter. "And whose idea was this restructuring?" "Lord Blackwood's, I presume." Edmund's silence was answer enough. Isabella began to pace, her morning dress rustling with each agitated step. "So you're simply going to cast aside people who have served you faithfully because your advisors have convinced you that blood relations are somehow inappropriate in royal service? Need I remind you that your own cousin holds 3 different positions within the palace?" "That's different," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Historical precedent supports." "Historical precedent?" Isabella's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. "Historical precedent also supported arranged marriages and treating queens as breeding stock with no voice in governance. Are those the traditions you'd like to restore as well?" The throne room fell silent except for the soft whisper of wind against the tall windows. Edmund stood perfectly still, his jaw set in a way that Isabella recognized as his battle stance. When he was crown prince, that expression had meant he was preparing to fight for something he believed in. Now it seemed to mean he was preparing to defend decisions he wasn't entirely sure were right. "The matter has been decided," he said finally. "Thomas and Catherine will be informed this afternoon, and new arrangements will be made for their responsibilities." Isabella stopped pacing and stared at her husband, really looking at him for perhaps the first time in months. The man who had once defied his father's wishes to marry a commoner, who had promised her that their love would change the very nature of the monarchy, was now standing before her reciting the words of traditionalist advisors as if they were gospel. "And what of our children?" she asked quietly. "Will you be restricting their relationships with their maternal grandparents next? Perhaps banning them from visiting their cousins lest someone think the royal bloodline is being contaminated?" "Don't be dramatic, Isabella." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm trying to understand where this ends. Today it's my siblings. Tomorrow it might be anyone who reminds the council that their queen wasn't born to this life." Edmund moved closer, and for a moment she saw a flash of the tender husband beneath the crown's weight. "You're reading too much into this. Your family isn't being banished or punished. They're simply being reassigned to more appropriate roles." "More appropriate?" Isabella shook her head. You mean less visible, less influential, less important? Before Edmund could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the throne room. Lord Blackwood entered without waiting for permission, his thin frame moving with the confidence of a man who knew his advice had become indispensable. He was a tall, angular person with silver hair and pale blue eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. Behind him followed two other council members, their expressions grave. "Your Majesties," Blackwood said with a bow that somehow managed to seem both respectful and condescending. "I trust the matter we discussed has been resolved." Isabella felt anger surge through her at the presumption in his words. Here was a man treating her husband's decision as if it were already settled, as if her opinion was merely an obstacle to be overcome rather than the voice of the Queen herself. "The matter is being discussed," Edmund said carefully. "Of course." Blackwood's smile was thin and cold. "Though I should mention that the afternoon papers will be running a piece about the modernization of royal protocols. It would be beneficial if any changes were implemented before the story breaks, to control the narrative appropriately." The afternoon papers. Isabella realized with growing horror that this entire conversation had been orchestrated not just by the Royal Council, but timed to coincide with a public relations campaign. Her family was being sacrificed not for the good of the monarchy, but for the appearance of the monarchy. "You've already spoken to the press," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Certain preparations have been made to ensure proper messaging, Your Majesty. The monarchy's image in these changing times requires careful management." "Whose image?" Isabella demanded, turning to face Edmund. "Mine or yours? Because it seems to me that this modernization looks suspiciously like erasing every trace of the life I brought to this marriage." The throne room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt dangerous. The council members shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting the Queen to challenge their plans so directly. Edmund looked trapped between his wife's anger and his advisor's expectations. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested. "No," Isabella said firmly. "If this decision affects my family, and if it's apparently important enough to coordinate with the press, then there's no reason for privacy. I want to understand exactly what modernization means for the people I love." Lord Blackwood cleared his throat delicately. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, the concern is that the current arrangement creates confusion about the line of royal authority. When members of the Queen's birth family hold official positions, it can appear that the Crown's decisions are influenced by personal rather than national interests." "Personal interests," Isabella repeated. "You mean having people around me who knew me before I became Queen? People who might remind me that I was once a person rather than just a symbol?" "That's not what Lord Blackwood meant," Edmund interjected, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Isn't it?" Isabella turned back to her husband. "Because it sounds to me like the council has decided that my connection to my former life is somehow problematic. That having family members who treat me like Isabella rather than Your Majesty undermines your authority." One of the other council members, Lord Crawford, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, please understand that this isn't personal. Royal protocol exists for important reasons. When lines of influence become unclear, it can destabilize not just the monarchy, but the government itself." "Destabilize?" Isabella felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "My brother organizing charity events and my sister managing social calendars is destabilizing the government? It's about precedent," Blackwood said smoothly. "About maintaining the dignity and authority that the Crown has represented for centuries. The people look to the royal family as an example of proper order and hierarchy." Isabella stared at the three men arrayed before her, each representing decades of traditional thinking and established power. Behind them stood her husband, the man she had loved enough to give up her former life for, now seemingly unable or unwilling to defend the choices they had made together. "And what about love?" she asked quietly. "What about the idea that the monarchy should represent the best of human nature, not just the oldest traditions? What about the promise that our reign would be different?" Edmund's face showed the first real emotion she had seen from him that morning, a flash of pain that reminded her of the passionate young prince who had once written her poetry and spoken of changing the world together. "Things are more complicated now," he said. The responsibilities of the Crown," Isabella interrupted, "include being an example of decency and loyalty. If we can't remain loyal to the people who supported us before we had power, what does that say about our character?" The tension in the room was palpable now, with the council members clearly uncomfortable with the Queen's direct challenge to their authority and Edmund caught between two incompatible loyalties. It was then that Isabella realized the true magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about her family losing their positions. This was about the systematic dismantling of everything that had made their reign different from those that came before. It was about turning her back into the decorative, silent queen that tradition demanded, rather than the partner in leadership that Edmund had once promised she would be. The weight of that understanding settled over her like a heavy cloak, and, for the first time since entering the throne room, Queen Isabella felt the full force of her isolation in this golden prison she had once thought was home. The afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows of Queen Isabella's private study, casting rainbow fragments across the mahogany desk where she sat surrounded by abandoned correspondence. 3 hours had passed since the confrontation in the throne room, and the silence that had followed her stormy exit still echoed in her mind. She had retreated to this sanctuary, a room that Edmund had given her on their first wedding anniversary, telling her it was a place where she could be herself rather than the crown. Now even this refuge felt compromised. Isabella held her younger sister Catherine's letter in trembling hands, reading the familiar handwriting that spoke of upcoming charity galas and social obligations. Catherine had no idea that her world was about to be upended, that the position she had worked so hard to master was being stripped away not because of any failure on her part, but because her blood was considered inappropriate for royal service. The door opened softly, and Margaret entered carrying a tea service. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but Isabella had learned to read the subtle signs of distress in her lady-in-waiting's demeanor. The way she moved just a fraction slower than usual, the slight tremor in her hands as she poured the tea, the manner in which she avoided direct eye contact, all spoke of news that would bring no comfort. "Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, setting the delicate china cup within reach. "I thought you might want to know that Lord Blackwood met with Master Thomas and Lady Catherine this afternoon." Isabella's hand stilled over the letter. "Already?" "Yes, Your Majesty. They were summoned to his office rather than being afforded the courtesy of an audience with His Majesty himself." Margaret's tone carried just enough emphasis to convey her disapproval of the protocol breach. "Master Thomas departed the palace approximately an hour ago. He asked me to give you this." From her apron, Margaret produced a sealed envelope bearing Isabella's brother's familiar script. Isabella took it with hands that felt suddenly cold, recognizing the weight of finality in the thick paper and careful penmanship. "And Catherine? Lady Catherine is in the blue drawing room. She requested a private moment with you when you are available." Margaret paused, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine concern. "She appeared quite distressed, Your Majesty." Isabella nodded, setting Thomas's letter aside unopened for the moment. "Please tell her I will see her immediately." As Margaret departed, Isabella rose from her desk and moved to the window that overlooked the palace's central courtyard. Below, life continued its normal rhythm. Guards walked their posts, servants hurried between buildings, and gardeners tended to the elaborate flower beds that were the pride of the palace grounds. The sight of such ordinary continuity in the face of her personal crisis struck her as almost absurd. The blue drawing room was one of the smaller reception chambers, decorated in soft pastels that had always reminded Isabella of her childhood home. It was here that she had first introduced Catherine to palace life, teaching her younger sister the intricate dance of royal protocol, while trying to preserve the warmth and spontaneity that made Catherine so effective in her role. She found Catherine standing before the room's ornate fireplace, her usually perfectly arranged blonde hair showing signs of distress, and her normally bright blue eyes red from recent tears. At 28, Catherine possessed the same quick intelligence that ran in their family, but she had always been the more sensitive of the siblings, taking setbacks and disappointments deeply to heart. "Isabella," Catherine said, turning as the Queen entered. The use of her given name rather than the formal "Your Majesty" spoke volumes about Catherine's emotional state. "I've been dismissed." "I know," Isabella replied softly, moving to embrace her sister. "I'm so sorry, Catherine. This isn't what any of us wanted." Catherine pulled back, her eyes searching Isabella's face. "Lord Blackwood said it was a matter of restructuring, that the royal household needed to modernize its approach to staffing. But the way he spoke, the things he implied." She shook her head. "This is about us, isn't it? About our family not being suitable for royal service." Isabella felt her heart break a little more at the pain in her sister's voice. Catherine had worked tirelessly to master every aspect of her role, learning foreign languages to better communicate with diplomatic wives, studying cultural customs to avoid international incidents, and developing relationships that had genuinely benefited the monarchy's standing abroad. To have all of that dismissed as inappropriate felt like a betrayal of the meritocracy that Isabella had believed their reign represented. It's about politics and old prejudices, Isabella said carefully. Lord Blackwood and the council have convinced Edmund that traditional protocol requires family members to maintain distance from official duties. But what about Lord Pemberton? Or Sir Marcus? Catherine named two of Edmund's cousins who held significant positions within the royal household. Are they being dismissed as well? Isabella's silence was answer enough. Catherine sank into one of the blue velvet armchairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. They're not, are they? Because their blood is royal blood, while ours is merely common. It doesn't matter how hard we work or how effectively we serve. It only matters what we were born to. The bitterness in Catherine's voice was something Isabella had never heard before, and it struck her like a physical blow. Her sister had always been optimistic about their elevated circumstances, viewing their rise to royal status as proof that talent and character could overcome birth. To see that faith crumbling was devastating. Catherine, listen to me, Isabella said, moving to sit across from her sister. This doesn't reflect on your worth or your accomplishments. You've been extraordinary in your service to the crown. Have I? Catherine laughed bitterly. Because Lord Blackwood seemed to suggest that my efforts were somehow inappropriate, that I had overstepped boundaries I wasn't even aware existed. He spoke about maintaining proper distinctions and ensuring that royal authority wasn't diluted by personal relationships. Isabella felt anger surge through her again. He had no right to speak to you that way. Your contributions have been invaluable, but not valuable enough to preserve, apparently. Catherine wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief. Do you know what hurt the most? He dismissed me from a role I created. I built those relationships with diplomatic families from nothing, developed protocols that have prevented 3 potential international incidents, and established connections that have benefited trade negotiations. But none of that matters because I'm the wrong sort of person to be doing such work. The injustice of it overwhelmed Isabella. Catherine's diplomatic skills had indeed been remarkable, her natural warmth and intelligence making her a perfect liaison between the formal royal household and the wives of foreign dignitaries who often felt intimidated by traditional palace protocol. She had single-handedly transformed what had been a source of social tension into one of the monarchy's greatest assets. What will you do now? Isabella asked. Catherine shrugged, a gesture that managed to convey both resignation and defiance. Return to our parents' house, I suppose. Try to remember what it was like to be ordinary. She looked up at Isabella with eyes that held a mixture of love and something that might have been pity. The question is what you will do. I don't understand. Isabella, they've just demonstrated that anyone connected to your former life is expendable. Today it was Thomas and me. Tomorrow it might be your friendship with Lady Sarah, or your sponsorship of the literacy programs, or anything else that marks you as having been someone other than a princess before you became queen. Catherine leaned forward intently. They're not just removing your family from the palace. They're removing your identity. The words hit Isabella with the force of revelation. She had been so focused on the immediate injustice to her siblings that she had failed to recognize the broader pattern. Catherine was right. This wasn't simply about staffing decisions or protocol. It was about systematically erasing everything that made Isabella's reign different from those that had come before. Edmund wouldn't allow that, Isabella said, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. Wouldn't he? Catherine's expression was gentle but uncompromising. Isabella, where was Edmund when Lord Blackwood was dismissing me like a servant who had broken a piece of china? Where was the king who supposedly values our contributions when his advisor was explaining to Thomas that his services were no longer required? Isabella had no answer to that. Edmund had indeed been absent from the actual conversations with her siblings, leaving Blackwood to deliver the news and handle any emotional fallout. It was an abdication of responsibility that spoke to either cowardice or complete agreement with the council's position. He's under tremendous pressure, Isabella said weakly. The council, the press, the expectations of governing, everyone who rules faces pressure, Catherine interrupted. The question is whether they allow that pressure to change who they fundamentally are. She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where they had often walked together during happier times. When you married Edmund, you told me that he promised your marriage would modernize the monarchy, that it would prove love and merit could triumph over birth and tradition. Do you still believe that's possible? Isabella joined her sister at the window, watching as evening shadows began to lengthen across the manicured landscape. In the distance, she could see Edmund walking alone through the rose garden, his head bowed in thought, and his hands clasped behind his back. Even from this distance, she could read the tension in his shoulders and the weight of burden in his stride. "I want to believe it," she admitted. "But today has shown me how fragile those ideals really are." One conversation with the council, and 15 years of partnership becomes subordinate to political convenience. Catherine placed a gentle hand on Isabella's arm. "Then, perhaps it's time to remind him what he promised, and what he's in danger of losing." Before Isabella could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression more troubled than ever. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. The evening edition of the Royal Observer has published an article about the palace restructuring." Isabella felt her stomach drop. "Show me." Margaret approached with the newspaper, its headlines visible even when folded. In bold letters across the front page, Isabella read, "Royal Household Modernizes. Queen's family members step back from official duties in historic protocol update." With trembling fingers, Isabella unfolded the paper and began to read. The article, clearly written with inside information, painted the dismissal of her siblings as a positive development in royal governance. It spoke of appropriate boundaries and traditional protocols, while carefully avoiding any mention of the personal cost or the arbitrary nature of the decision. Most damning was a quote attributed to palace sources close to His Majesty, stating that the king believes it's important for the monarchy to maintain clear distinctions between official royal duties and personal family obligations, ensuring that governance remains untainted by emotional considerations. "Untainted by emotional considerations," Isabella read aloud, her voice shaking with rage. As if caring about family is somehow corrupting to leadership. Catherine read over her shoulder, her face growing pale. "They've made it sound like we requested to step back, as if this was our choice rather than our banishment. And they've painted Edmund as a thoughtful leader making difficult but necessary decisions." Isabella crumpled the newspaper in her hands. "There's no mention of the loyal service you've provided or the value you've added to the monarchy. You've simply become obstacles to proper governance." The three women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of public humiliation added to private betrayal. Isabella realized that by the time this newspaper reached the breakfast tables of the kingdom tomorrow morning, her siblings would be remembered not as valuable contributors to royal life, but as examples of inappropriate influence finally corrected by wise leadership. "Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, "Master Thomas asked me to tell you that he bears no ill will toward you or His Majesty. He said to remember that love doesn't always require proximity, and that family bonds aren't severed by palace protocol." Isabella felt tears threaten for the first time that day. Thomas had always been the diplomat in their family, the one who found ways to ease tensions and build bridges. Even in his dismissal, he was trying to protect her from additional pain. "And what did you tell him?" Isabella asked. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I told him that true loyalty works in both directions, Your Majesty, and that some of us remember when this palace was a place where character mattered more than bloodline." It was perhaps the most direct criticism of recent events that Margaret had ever voiced, and it crystallized something in Isabella's mind. If even the palace staff were recognizing the injustice of the situation, then Edmund's advisors had miscalculated badly. They had assumed that dismissing her family would be seen as appropriate modernization, but instead it was being recognized as the abandonment of principles that had made their reign popular. Catherine moved toward the door, gathering her shawl in reticule. "I should go. There's no point in prolonging this, and my presence might make things more difficult for you." "Catherine, wait." Isabella caught her sister's hand. "This isn't over. I won't accept that years of service and loyalty can be dismissed so casually." "What will you do?" Catherine asked. Isabella looked out the window again, where Edmund was still walking alone in the gardens. The man who had once promised that their love would change the monarchy was now allowing advisors to systematically dismantle everything they had built together. But he was also the same person who had risked his father's wrath to marry her, who had spoken passionately about creating a more just and compassionate reign. Somewhere inside the isolated king walking through those gardens was the idealistic prince she had fallen in love with. The question was whether that man still existed, and whether he was strong enough to overcome the weight of crown and council. "I'm going to fight for what we built together," Isabella said finally. "And I'm going to remind my husband that some things are more important than the approval of advisors who never supported our vision in the first place. Catherine smiled for the first time since Isabella had entered the room. Then, I'll pray that the man you married is still there to hear you. As Catherine departed, and Margaret busied herself with clearing away the untouched tea service, Isabella remained at the window watching her husband's solitary walk. The shadows were lengthening now, and soon darkness would fall over the palace grounds. But tomorrow would bring new light, and with it the chance to discover whether 15 years of marriage and partnership could survive one day of political expedience. The battle for the soul of their monarchy was about to begin, and Isabella intended to fight it with every tool at her disposal. The question was whether Edmund would stand with her or against her when the final accounting came due. The grandfather clock in the royal bedchamber struck midnight as Isabella finally heard Edmund's footsteps in the corridor outside. She had been waiting for hours, seated in the window alcove that overlooked the moonlit gardens, still wearing the emerald dress she had put on that morning when the world seemed like a simpler place. The events of the day felt both incredibly recent and impossibly distant, as if the woman who had walked confidently into the throne room 12 hours earlier belonged to a different lifetime. Edmund entered quietly, clearly hoping to avoid the confrontation that both of them knew was inevitable. In the silvery moonlight, Isabella could see how the day had aged him further. His usually precise posture had given way to a weary slouch, and when he moved to light the bedside lamp, his hands shook slightly with exhaustion or stress. "I thought you might be asleep," he said without looking at her, beginning the mechanical process of removing his formal jacket and cufflinks. "You hoped I would be asleep," Isabella corrected gently. "But we both know this conversation can't wait until morning." Edmund paused in his undressing, his shoulders tensing as he recognized the tone of voice that meant his wife was prepared for battle. When he finally turned to face her, Isabella was struck by how much he looked like his father in that moment, wearing the same expression of weary resignation that she remembered from their early meetings with the late king. "Isabella, if this is about your family, this is about us," she interrupted, rising from the window seat. "About what we promised each other and what we've allowed ourselves to become." Edmund sat heavily on the edge of their bed, suddenly looking older than his years. "Do you think this was easy for me? Do you think I enjoyed making that decision? I think you avoided making it for as long as possible, and then allowed other people to make it for you." Isabella moved closer, studying her husband's face in the lamplight. "When was the last time you looked me in the eye and told me what you actually believe, rather than what your advisors have convinced you is politically necessary?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Edmund rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture Isabella recognized from their early years of marriage when he was struggling with difficult decisions about policy or personnel. "You don't understand the pressures I'm facing," he said finally. "The Parliament is questioning our budget allocations, the press is scrutinizing every decision we make, and the Council keeps reminding me that public opinion can turn against a monarchy faster than any of us want to believe. So you threw my family to the wolves to appease critics who would never support us anyway." Isabella kept her voice steady, but she could feel anger burning beneath her controlled exterior. "You sacrificed 15 years of loyal service to people who see our marriage as a mistake that needs constant correction." Edmund looked up at her then, and for a moment she saw a flash of the passionate young prince who had once declared that love would guide his reign more than tradition. "They weren't wrong about everything," he said quietly. "Having your family in official positions does create complications. When Thomas organized that charity event last month and invited those political activists, he invited people working to improve literacy rates in rural areas." Isabella cut him off. "The same work that your own grandmother supported for 40 years. Since when did education become politically controversial? Since those activists started questioning our land policies and suggesting that royal estates could be better used for public good." Edmund's voice carried a hint of the defensiveness that had become increasingly common in their conversations. The council pointed out that Thomas's associations could be interpreted as royal endorsement of potentially destabilizing ideas. Isabella stared at her husband in disbelief. Destabilizing ideas like making sure children can read? Like questioning whether ancient land grants should take precedence over modern housing needs? "You're oversimplifying." "No, I'm seeing clearly for the first time in months." Isabella began to pace the length of their bedroom, her silk slippers making no sound on the thick Persian carpet. "I'm seeing that the man I married, who once told me that we would use our position to help people rather than simply preserve privilege, has been replaced by someone who considers basic human compassion a political liability. Edmund stood abruptly, his own anger finally surfacing. And what would you have me do? Ignore the advice of people who have served the crown for decades? Risk the stability of the monarchy for the sake of idealistic gestures that accomplish nothing? Accomplish nothing? Isabella's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. Thomas's literacy programs have provided reading instruction to over 10,000 children. Catherine's diplomatic work has strengthened our relationships with 6 different nations. My hospital visits and charity patronages have raised millions for medical research and social services. How is any of that nothing? Because it's not sustainable, Edmund shot back. Because every program you start, every cause you champion, creates expectations that the crown can't fulfill. People begin to see us as social workers rather than symbols of national unity. They start thinking the monarchy should solve their problems instead of providing stability and continuity. The words fell between them like stones, each one landing with devastating impact. Isabella realized that she was hearing not just Edmund's current thinking, but the fundamental philosophy that had gradually replaced their shared vision over the past several years. When did you stop believing that helping people was part of our duty? She asked quietly. Edmund turned away, moving to the tall windows that looked out over the same gardens where Isabella had watched him walking alone that afternoon. When I realized that the monarchy's survival depends on maintaining distance from the day-to-day struggles of governance. When I understood that being loved is less important than being respected. And who taught you that wisdom? Lord Blackwood. Experience taught me. Reality taught me. Edmund's reflection in the window glass looked ghost-like and insubstantial. My father warned me that marrying outside the nobility would create complications I couldn't foresee. I thought love would be enough to overcome those obstacles. Isabella felt something cold and final settling in her chest. And now you've decided he was right. Now I've decided that protecting the institution matters more than personal feelings. Edmund turned back to face her, his expression resolute in a way that reminded her painfully of the man she had fallen in love with, except that resolution was now being used against everything they had built together. The council has made it clear that continuing to blur the lines between royal duty and personal relationships will ultimately weaken the crown's authority. The council, Isabella repeated. Not your own judgment, not your own values, not the promises you made to me and to the people of this kingdom. My judgment, Edmund said with forced patience, is that the monarchy must be preserved for future generations. That means making difficult choices about how we conduct ourselves and who we allow to influence royal policy. Isabella moved to stand directly in front of her husband, searching his face for any sign of the idealistic prince who had once written her poetry about changing the world together. And what about our children? She asked. When Prince Alexander grows up and wants to marry someone he loves rather than someone the council approves of, will you give him the same speech about preserving the institution? When Princess Sophia develops her own ideas about how the monarchy should serve the people, will you tell her that personal feelings matter less than political expedience? For the first time that evening, Edmund looked genuinely uncertain. Their children had always been the bridge between their private happiness and their public duties, the living proof that love and responsibility could coexist within royal life. Our children will be raised to understand their obligations, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You mean they'll be raised to suppress any impulse toward compassion or innovation that might threaten traditional power structures? Isabella shook her head. You're not preserving the monarchy, Edmund. You're embalming it. The silence that followed was broken by a soft knock at the bedchamber door. Margaret's voice called quietly through the heavy wood. Your Majesties, forgive the intrusion, but there's been an urgent development. Edmund frowned at the interruption, but crossed to open the door. Margaret stood in the corridor with a man Isabella recognized as one of the palace's night guards, both of them wearing expressions of barely controlled anxiety. What is it? Edmund asked. Your Majesty, the guard said with a quick bow. There's a situation developing outside the palace gates. A large crowd has gathered, and they're calling for the Queen to address them. Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. A crowd? At this hour? Margaret stepped forward. Your Majesty, word of the day's events seems to have spread beyond what was printed in the newspapers. People are gathering to express their support for your Majesty and their displeasure with the dismissal of your family members. Edmund's face had gone pale. How many people? Several hundred, your Majesty, and the number is growing. They're carrying candles and signs expressing support for the Queen's charitable work. The crowd appears peaceful, but they're quite vocal in their demands to hear from Her Majesty directly. Isabella moved past Edmund to address the guard directly. What exactly are they saying? The guard glanced nervously at the king before responding. They're chanting "Long live Queen Isabella" and "Bring back the people's princess." Some are carrying signs asking why the royal family is abandoning charitable work and community service. The irony was not lost on Isabella. The council had dismissed her family members to avoid the appearance that the monarchy was being influenced by inappropriate relationships. But the public reaction suggested that those relationships were exactly what made the royal family relevant to ordinary citizens. Your Majesty, Margaret added quietly. Master Thomas and Lady Catherine are apparently in the crowd. Word is that they came to show their continued support for the crown, but their presence seems to have encouraged others to join the demonstration. Edmund stared at the guard as if the man had delivered news of an invasion. Double the security around the palace grounds. Make sure no one attempts to breach the gates. Edmund, Isabella said sharply, these are our people expressing support for charitable work and family loyalty. They're not enemies to be repelled. They're a mob gathered at midnight making demands of the crown, Edmund replied tersely. This is exactly the kind of destabilizing situation the council warned about. Isabella felt everything crystallize in that moment. Here was a perfect demonstration of the choice facing their monarchy. They could view the crowd as a threat to be managed and contained, or as citizens expressing genuine concern about the direction of royal leadership. Edmund's instinctive response to increase security rather than engage with the public revealed exactly how far he had traveled from their original vision. I want to address them, Isabella said quietly. Absolutely not. Edmund's response was immediate and firm. You will not reward this kind of behavior by giving in to their demands. I will not ignore people who have gathered to express support for the values we once shared. Isabella moved toward the door. They deserve to know that their concerns have been heard. Edmund stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Isabella, I forbid it. The words hung in the air like a physical barrier. In 15 years of marriage, Edmund had never used his royal authority to override her personal judgment. The fact that he was doing so now, in defense of policies she fundamentally disagreed with, marked a line being crossed from which there might be no return. You forbid it, Isabella repeated slowly. I do. As king, I cannot allow the Queen to engage with unauthorized public demonstrations. It sets a precedent that could undermine royal authority and encourage future disruptions. Isabella looked at her husband, really seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The man standing before her was no longer the idealistic prince who had promised that their reign would be different. He had become exactly the kind of traditional monarch that they had once criticized together, someone who saw public engagement as a threat rather than an opportunity. Very well, she said quietly. I understand your position perfectly. Edmund seemed relieved by her apparent acquiescence. Good. We'll let security handle the situation, and by morning the crowd will have dispersed. Isabella nodded, but her mind was already working through the implications of what had just happened. Edmund had chosen to align himself completely with his advisor's vision of royal isolation and traditional protocol. More importantly, he had chosen to use his authority as king to prevent her from following her own conscience as queen. Margaret, Isabella said calmly, please inform the crowd that I appreciate their support and that their concerns have been noted. Your Majesty, Margaret replied with a curtsy. As the guard departed and Margaret began to withdraw, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. And Margaret, please also inform them that while I cannot address them tonight due to protocol, I will be visiting the Children's Hospital tomorrow as previously scheduled, and anyone who wishes to discuss the monarchy's commitment to charitable work is welcome to join me there. Edmund whirled around, his eyes flashing with anger. Isabella, what do you think you're doing? I'm finding a way to honor both royal protocol and my responsibilities to the people, she replied serenely. You said I couldn't address an unauthorized demonstration. You said nothing about continuing my regularly scheduled charitable duties. The look on Edmund's face told Isabella that the battle for their marriage and their monarchy had just begun in earnest. Dawn broke gray and overcast across Ravencrest Palace, matching the somber mood that had settled over the royal household like a heavy blanket. Isabella had not slept, instead spending the pre-dawn hours at her writing desk composing letters to various charitable organizations and reviewing her schedule for the coming weeks. If Edmund was determined to limit her family's influence within the palace, she would ensure that her public duties became more visible and impactful than ever before. The morning newspapers lay spread across her breakfast table like battle plans, each one offering a different interpretation of the previous night's gathering outside the palace gates. The Royal Observer, clearly influenced by palace sources, described it as an unfortunate display of public emotion that demonstrated why clear boundaries between royal duties and personal relationships were necessary. The People's Herald, however, painted a dramatically different picture, calling it a spontaneous outpouring of support for the Queen's humanitarian work and questioning why the royal family seemed to be distancing itself from charitable causes. Most concerning was the morning edition of the Independent Monitor, which had somehow obtained detailed information about the dismissal of Isabella's siblings. The article included quotes from unnamed palace insiders suggesting that the Queen had been increasingly difficult to manage and that her family's influence had created inappropriate pressure on royal decision-making. Reading between the lines, Isabella could see Lord Blackwood's fingerprints all over the story. Margaret entered the breakfast room carrying a silver tray laden with correspondence, her expression more troubled than usual. "Your Majesty, the Morning Post has brought several urgent communications." Isabella set down her teacup, noting the official seals on several of the letters. "From whom?" "The Archbishop of Canterbury requests an audience at your earliest convenience. The Prime Minister's office has sent a formal inquiry about your schedule for next week. And there are over 50 letters from heads of various charitable organizations expressing concern about recent developments." Margaret paused, clearly hesitant to continue. "There's also a personal message from Princess Alexandra." Princess Alexandra was Edmund's younger sister, who had married a German prince and lived primarily in Berlin. For her to send a message so quickly suggested that news of the palace upheaval had already spread beyond the kingdom's borders. Isabella opened Alexandra's letter first, recognizing her sister-in-law's bold handwriting. "My dearest Isabella," the letter began, "word has reached us here about the recent changes in palace protocol, and I felt compelled to write immediately. While I understand the pressures my brother faces, I cannot help but think this decision represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a monarchy relevant in the modern world. Your family has brought nothing but honor to the crown, and their dismissal will be seen as a retreat into exactly the kind of outdated thinking that threatens royal institutions across Europe. Please know that you have my complete support, and that Fritz joins me in hoping that wiser counsel will prevail. Your devoted sister, Alexandra." The letter's diplomatic language barely concealed Alexandra's shock and disapproval. If Edmund's own sister was criticizing the decision, it suggested that the council's assurances about broad support for traditional protocol had been overstated. Before Isabella could open the other correspondence, Edmund appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room. He was already dressed in his formal day clothes, suggesting that his morning had begun even earlier than hers, probably with emergency meetings about the previous night's demonstration. "Good morning," he said stiffly, taking his usual seat across from her at the mahogany table. "Good morning." Isabella's tone was equally formal. The warmth that had once characterized their private moments together seemed to have evaporated completely. Edmund glanced at the newspapers spread between them, his jaw tightening as he read the headlines. "I see the press has already decided how to interpret last night's events. They seem as divided as everyone else about whether supporting charitable work is appropriate for the royal family." Isabella folded Alexandra's letter carefully. "Your sister writes that news of recent changes has reached Berlin. Alexandra has always been overly sentimental about protocol matters," Edmund replied dismissively. "Distance makes it easier to criticize difficult decisions. Or perhaps distance makes it easier to see those decisions clearly." Isabella met his gaze directly. "She's not the only one expressing concern. The Archbishop has requested an urgent audience, and the Prime Minister's office is inquiring about my schedule." Edmund's expression grew more guarded. "I'm sure they're simply seeking clarification about recent adjustments. Nothing that can't be managed through proper channels." "Managed through Lord Blackwood, you mean?" Before Edmund could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Moments later, Lord Blackwood himself appeared, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Behind him followed Sir Marcus, one of Edmund's cousins who served as deputy private secretary. "Your Majesties," Blackwood said with a hurried bow, "forgive the intrusion, but we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention." Isabella noticed that despite his words of apology, Blackwood's attention was focused entirely on Edmund. She might as well have been invisible. "What kind of situation?" Edmund asked, gesturing for the men to sit. Sir Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, The children's hospital where the Queen is scheduled to visit this morning has been contacted by numerous media outlets requesting access to cover the visit. Apparently, word has spread that members of the public plan to attend as well. How many members of the public? Isabella asked, though she suspected Blackwood would continue to direct his responses to Edmund. Reports suggest several hundred people, Your Majesty, Sir Marcus replied, at least acknowledging her presence. Many of them appear to be supporters who attended last night's gathering outside the palace. Blackwood leaned forward, his pale eyes focused intently on the king. Your Majesty, this creates an unacceptable security risk. More importantly, it transforms what should be a routine charitable visit into a political demonstration. I strongly recommend canceling the engagement. Isabella felt her temper flare. Canceling a visit to sick children because too many people want to express support for charitable work? How exactly does that serve the monarchy's interests? It serves the monarchy's interests, Blackwood replied coolly, finally, looking at her, by preventing the Queen from becoming a focal point for public dissatisfaction with recent policy decisions. The casual dismissal of her judgment and the implications of his words struck Isabella like a slap. Policy decisions that were made without consulting me and implemented without regard for their impact on people who have served the crown faithfully. Your Majesty, Blackwood continued in the same maddeningly calm tone. The Queen's emotional attachment to these matters is precisely why the Council felt it necessary to provide clearer guidance about appropriate royal conduct. Edmund had remained silent throughout this exchange, but Isabella could see him processing the conversation with the calculating expression he wore during difficult parliamentary negotiations. She realized with growing horror that he was actually considering Blackwood's recommendation to cancel her hospital visit. Edmund, she said quietly, you cannot seriously be thinking of preventing me from visiting children with cancer because their parents want to express gratitude for royal support of medical research. I'm thinking of preventing a situation that could spiral out of control and damage the monarchy's reputation, Edmund replied carefully. If this visit becomes a rallying point for criticism of recent decisions, then perhaps the problem lies with the decisions themselves, not with the criticism, Isabella interrupted. When charitable work becomes politically controversial, we've lost sight of what the monarchy is supposed to represent. Blackwood's expression had grown increasingly stern during their exchange. Your Majesty, with respect, this is precisely the kind of thinking that led to the current difficulties. The monarchy represents continuity, stability, and respect for established order. It does not represent progressive politics or social activism. Isabella stared at the man who had become her husband's primary advisor, finally, understanding the full scope of his influence. And what about compassion? What about service to others? What about using privilege responsibly to help those who have less? Those are admirable personal qualities, Blackwood replied smoothly. But they must be expressed within appropriate boundaries. When royal charitable work begins to challenge existing social structures or creates expectations that the crown cannot fulfill, it becomes a liability rather than an asset. Challenging social structures? Isabella's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. I visit hospitals and schools. I support literacy programs and medical research. How is any of that threatening to social order? Sir Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved far beyond the morning's scheduling crisis. Perhaps we could find a compromise solution? Proceed with the hospital visit, but limit media access and public participation? No, Blackwood said firmly. Any public appearance by the Queen today will be interpreted as a response to last night's demonstration. It sends the message that royal policy can be influenced by public pressure, which sets a dangerous precedent. Isabella realized that she was watching the final transformation of her marriage and her role as queen. Edmund was allowing his advisor to dictate not just policy, but the fundamental nature of her relationship with the public she had spent 15 years serving. So your recommendation, she said slowly, is that I should avoid any public engagement that might be seen as responsive to public sentiment, that I should ignore the people who gathered last night to express support for charitable work, and disappoint the children who are expecting my visit today, in order to demonstrate that the monarchy is immune to public opinion. I recommend, Blackwood replied, that your Majesty focus on duties that are clearly within traditional royal scope, rather than activities that blur the lines between ceremonial function and political advocacy. Isabella looked at Edmund, waiting for him to defend their shared history of public service or at least acknowledge the absurdity of treating a hospital visit as political advocacy. Instead, She watched him nod slowly as he considered Blackwood's words. The Children's Hospital, Edmund said finally, can be rescheduled for a time when public interest has subsided. The words fell between them like a final verdict. Isabella realized that the man she had married, who had once promised that their reign would be remembered for its compassion and accessibility, was now willing to disappoint sick children to appease advisors who saw public affection as a political liability. I see, she said quietly, rising from her chair. So we've reached the point where visiting hospitalized children is considered inappropriate royal behavior. We've reached the point, Edmund replied with forced patience, where we recognize that every public appearance carries political implications that must be carefully managed. Isabella moved toward the breakfast room's tall windows, looking out at the gardens where she had spent so many happy hours with her children, teaching them about responsibility and service to others. How would she explain to Princess Sophia that her planned charity work would need to be curtailed because it might create political complications? How would she tell Prince Alexander that using royal influence to help people was now considered inappropriate? Your Majesty, Margaret's voice came from the doorway, startling everyone in the room. Forgive the interruption, but there's a delegation from the hospital here to see you. The head pediatrician and several parents of patients you've worked with. They're requesting just a moment of your time. Blackwood stood abruptly. Absolutely not. Her Majesty is not receiving unscheduled visitors today. They're not unscheduled, Isabella said quietly, still looking out the window. They're the people whose lives I've been trying to improve for 15 years. They're the reason I became queen in the first place. She turned to face the room, her decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. Margaret, please tell them I'll see them immediately. And send word to the hospital that I will indeed be keeping my appointment this morning. Isabella, Edmund warned. I've already explained why that's not possible. No, she replied, moving toward the door. You've explained why you think it's not politically convenient. But you haven't explained why disappointing sick children serves any legitimate royal purpose. And you haven't explained why expressing compassion has become a threat to the monarchy. Blackwood stepped forward as if to physically block her path. Your Majesty, I cannot allow you to make a decision that contradicts direct royal policy. Isabella stopped and looked at the man who had systematically destroyed everything she and Edmund had built together. You cannot allow me? I wasn't aware that Lord Blackwood had been appointed regent. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Everyone in the room recognized that a line had been crossed, though exactly which line remained to be seen. Edmund, Isabella said without taking her eyes off Blackwood, I'm going to ask you one final time. Are you the king, or is Lord Blackwood? Because if you're still king, then you need to decide right now whether you're going to stand with your advisors or with your wife. Edmund stood slowly, his face pale but resolute. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of marriage and the finality of an irreversible choice. I stand with the crown, he said quietly. And the crown requires that you cancel today's engagement. Isabella felt something fundamental break inside her chest, like a supporting beam finally, giving way under too much weight. The man she had loved enough to give up her former life for had just chosen political expedience over everything they had once stood for together. Very well, she said with perfect calm. I understand your position completely. But, as she walked past the assembled men and out of the breakfast room, Isabella was already planning exactly how she would respond to her husband's betrayal. If Edmund was determined to choose his advisors over his wife, then she would show him exactly what that choice would cost him. The delegation from the Children's Hospital waited in the blue drawing room, their faces bearing the mixture of hope and anxiety that Isabella had come to recognize in people who desperately needed royal support to continue their vital work. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head pediatrician, stood with 3 parents whose children Isabella had visited regularly during their treatments. Behind them, Margaret waited with an expression of barely concealed defiance that suggested the loyal lady-in-waiting understood exactly what was at stake in this moment. Isabella entered the room knowing that her next actions would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her reign as queen. The conversation with Edmund and Lord Blackwood had crystallized everything for her. She could submit to their vision of a monarchy insulated from human connection and focused solely on ceremonial functions, or she could fight for the principles that had made her marriage and her royal service meaningful. Your Majesty, Dr. Mitchell said with a respectful curtsy, thank you so much for seeing us on such short notice. We wouldn't have presumed to disturb you if the matter weren't urgent. Isabella gestured for everyone to sit, noting the worn clothing tired faces of the parents in the group. These were people who had been spending days and nights at their children's bedsides, fighting battles that no parent should have to face. The idea that seeing them was somehow politically inappropriate struck her as not just wrong, but obscene. "Please, tell me what's brought you here," Isabella said gently. Mrs. Patterson, whose 7-year-old daughter Emma had been battling leukemia for over a year, spoke first. "Your Majesty, we heard that there might be changes to the royal patronage program, and we wanted you to know how much your support has meant to our families." Isabella felt her heart clench. These people had somehow learned about the broader implications of the morning's policy discussions, probably through staff members who understood that royal restructuring often meant the elimination of charitable commitments. "The fundraising events you've organized have provided our ward with new equipment that's literally saving lives," added Mr. Chun, whose young son had undergone experimental treatment made possible by royal-sponsored research. "Emma's new chemotherapy protocol exists because of grants from your Medical Research Foundation." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward earnestly. "Your Majesty, beyond the financial support, your personal visits have provided something that no amount of money can buy. When children see the Queen taking time to read to them or play games with them, it gives them a sense that they matter to the world beyond their illness. For many of our patients, your visits are the highlight of their treatment." Isabella listened to their words with growing resolve, understanding that this was precisely the kind of impact that Lord Blackwood considered politically inappropriate. The idea that royal attention should be reserved for ceremonial functions rather than direct human service represented everything that was wrong with the advisor's vision of monarchy. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that my commitment to your children and to the hospital has not wavered. Whatever changes may come to royal protocol, my personal dedication to this work remains absolute." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Emma asks about you constantly. She's been looking forward to your visit today for weeks." The mention of today's scheduled visit brought everything into sharp focus. Isabella realized that she was facing the most important decision of her reign. She could follow Edmund's directive to cancel the hospital visit, disappointing not just these parents, but dozens of children who were counting on her presence. Or she could honor her commitment and face whatever consequences Edmund and his advisors chose to impose. "About today's visit," Isabella began, seeing Margaret tense from her position near the door. "I need you to understand that there have been some complications." Dr. Mitchell's face fell. "Complications?" Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would make her decision irrevocable. "There are those who believe that royal charitable work should be curtailed if it becomes too visible or generates too much public support. The concern is that when people gather to express appreciation for the monarchy's humanitarian efforts, it creates political complications." The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Chun was the first to speak, his voice quiet but clear. "Your Majesty, are you saying that our gratitude is a problem?" "I'm saying that some people believe it is," Isabella replied honestly. "But I'm also saying that I disagree with those people fundamentally." She stood and moved to the window that overlooked the palace's front courtyard, where she could see a small but growing crowd of people holding signs expressing support for royal charitable work. Many of them were families she recognized from hospital visits and charity events, people whose lives had been touched by royal service over the years. "Margaret," Isabella said without turning around, "please send word to the hospital that I will be arriving as scheduled this afternoon. And please inform the head of security that I will require standard protective measures, not the enhanced protocols that might suggest this is anything other than a routine charitable visit." She heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of her curtsy. "Yes, Your Majesty." Dr. Mitchell stood slowly, her expression showing dawning understanding of what Isabella was really saying. "Your Majesty, are you certain? We wouldn't want to create difficulties for you." Isabella turned back to face the group, and, for the first time in days, she felt completely certain of her path. "The only difficulty would be abandoning children who are depending on me because some advisors think compassion is politically inconvenient." Before anyone could respond, the drawing room's doors burst open and Edmund strode in, his face flushed with anger and his formal composure completely abandoned. Behind him came Lord Blackwood and 2 palace guards, creating an atmosphere of crisis that filled the room with tension. "Isabella, what do you think you're doing?" Edmund demanded, apparently oblivious to the presence of the hospital delegation. Isabella felt a moment of profound sadness for the man who had once been her partner in everything. The Edmund who stood before her now seemed incapable of recognizing that treating a charitable commitment as a crisis was itself the problem. "I'm honoring a commitment to people who depend on royal support," she said calmly. "I'm doing what we promised to do when we accepted the responsibility of the crown." "You're defying a direct order from your king," Edmund shot back, his voice rising in a way that made the hospital visitors shift uncomfortably. "I'm fulfilling my duties as queen," Isabella replied with perfect composure. "Unless you're suggesting that visiting sick children is no longer part of those duties." The confrontation was playing out before an audience of people who had never seen the royal family as anything other than united in service to the public good. Isabella could see the shock and dismay on their faces as they witnessed the fundamental disagreement between king and queen about something as basic as charitable work. Lord Blackwood stepped forward, his pale eyes focused on the hospital delegation with obvious disapproval. "Perhaps these good people should return at a more appropriate time, when their majesties can address their concerns through proper channels." Dr. Mitchell looked between the king and queen uncertainly, clearly recognizing that she and her companions had stumbled into the middle of a royal crisis. "Your majesties, we don't wish to cause any trouble. We simply wanted to express our gratitude and ensure continued support for our patients." "Your gratitude is noted," Lord Blackwood said dismissively, "and appropriate representatives will be in touch about future arrangements." The casual dismissal of these people who had fought so hard for their children's lives sparked something fierce and protective in Isabella. She had spent 15 years building relationships with families like this, understanding their struggles and working to improve their circumstances. To see them treated as an inconvenience was intolerable. "Dr. Mitchell," Isabella said firmly, "please proceed with preparations for this afternoon's visit. I will see you at 2 o'clock as scheduled." Edmund stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intense whisper that nonetheless carried clearly through the room. "Isabella, if you proceed with this visit against my express directive, there will be consequences that extend far beyond today." Isabella met her husband's gaze directly, seeing in his eyes the stranger he had become over the past months. The man who had once promised that their love would transform the monarchy was now threatening her for wanting to visit hospitalized children. "What consequences, Edmund? Are you planning to have me arrested for showing compassion? Will you confine me to the palace for committing the crime of keeping my word to people who trust me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that everyone in the room understood was about far more than a single hospital visit. This was about whether the monarchy would serve the people or simply rule them, whether royal privilege came with meaningful responsibility or was simply an ornament to be polished and preserved. Edmund's face had gone pale, and Isabella could see him struggling with the implications of what he might have to do to enforce his authority. Lord Blackwood, however, showed no such hesitation. "Your Majesty," he said to Edmund in a voice that carried unmistakable urgency, "decisive action is required here. The Queen's defiance cannot be allowed to undermine royal authority." Isabella felt everything crystallize in that moment. Here was the choice that had been building for months, finally, presented in terms that could not be avoided or postponed. Edmund could stand with his advisors and treat her as a subject to be controlled, or he could remember the partnership that had once defined their marriage and their reign. She watched her husband's face as he processed the moment, seeing the internal struggle between the man she had married and the king he had allowed himself to become. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of final judgment. "Guards," he said quietly, "the Queen is to be escorted to her private quarters and remains there until further notice. All of her scheduled public engagements are canceled indefinitely." The words fell into stunned silence. Dr. Mitchell's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while the parents stared in disbelief at the spectacle of a king essentially imprisoning his queen for wanting to honor a charitable commitment. Isabella felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The decision had been made, and Edmund had chosen his side definitively. There would be no more uncertainty about where her husband's loyalties lay or what kind of monarchy they had become. "Very well," she said with perfect calm, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "I understand your position completely." She turned to address the hospital delegation directly, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years as queen. "Dr. Mitchell, please know that while I will not be able to visit this afternoon, my commitment to your patients and their families remains unchanged. There are resources beyond the official royal household that can continue supporting your work." Before the guards could move to escort her from the room, Isabella walked to where Margaret stood by the door. "Margaret," Please see that our guests are properly attended to and that appropriate arrangements are made for transportation back to the hospital. Your Majesty, Margaret said with a curtsy that managed to convey both respect and defiance. As Isabella prepared to leave the room, Mrs. Patterson suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. Your Majesty, what should I tell Emma? She's been asking about you all week. Isabella paused, turning back to face the woman whose daughter had become a symbol of everything she was fighting for. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Tell Emma, she said clearly, making sure her words carried to everyone in the room, including the guards and Lord Blackwood, that queens are not always free to keep their promises when kings are afraid of compassion. But tell her also that there are many ways to serve people, and that her fight against illness inspires everyone who knows her. With that, Queen Isabella walked from the room with her head held high, leaving behind a husband who had chosen protocol over principle and advisors who had chosen control over compassion. As the palace guards flanked her in the corridor, she realized that her real battle for the soul of the monarchy was just beginning. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Patterson beginning to cry, and the sound followed her down the marble hallway like an indictment of everything the royal family had allowed itself to become.